They called me just a secretary, and for a long time, I almost believed them. Every time those words echoed in my mind, they seemed to grow heavier. I started to question my worth, my choices, and even the quiet dreams I kept hidden from everyone. But deep inside, there was a spark that refused to die out. I didn't want to prove them wrong out of anger. I wanted to prove myself right. I wanted to show that titles don't define ambition, and that sometimes the smallest roles hold the biggest potential. At work, I was the one behind the scenes, the one typing out memos, organizing schedules, preparing coffee before meetings started. People barely noticed me, except when something went wrong. My family would ask, "When will you get a real job?" I would smile and say, "Someday." They didn't know how many nights I stayed up learning, reading about management, studying business trends, trying to understand how success is built from the ground up. While they saw a secretary, I was quietly building the foundation of something bigger. The mockery became my motivation. Every time I heard a dismissive comment, it fueled me to work harder. I started paying attention to everything around me, the way my boss handled clients, how negotiations unfolded, how small details made big differences. I realized that success wasn't about the position you start from, it was about how much you absorb, how deeply you observe, and how far you're willing to go to learn. My desk may have been small, but from there I saw everything. There were days when it felt impossible, when dreams seemed too far away and the weight of other people's opinions pressed down on my chest like a stone. Sometimes I wanted to quit, to stop chasing something invisible. But then I remembered how it felt to be underestimated, how it felt to be invisible, how it felt to have people laugh when you talked about your dreams. That feeling became my fire. I didn't need applause. I needed progress. I didn't need recognition. I needed growth. So, I started setting quiet goals. I saved money, enrolled in online business courses, attended free workshops during weekends, and read every book I could find about leadership and entrepreneurship. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't need validation. My progress didn't need an audience. The nights were long and lonely, but I started feeling something new: pride. The kind that doesn't come from being praised, but from knowing you're becoming more than what people expected you to be. Over time, the world around me started to shift. My ideas began to matter. My words carried more weight. The same people who once ignored me started asking for my input. My family noticed a change too, though they didn't quite understand it yet. They thought I was just getting lucky, maybe finally taking my job seriously. They didn't realize I was quietly transforming into someone they never imagined I could become. The once simple secretary was now running projects, managing accounts, and negotiating deals. Every milestone was a silent victory, a reminder that no insult can stop someone who has already decided to rise. But it wasn't just about proving them wrong anymore. It became about proving to myself that I could build something beautiful from the ruins of other people's doubt. Every sarcastic smile, every careless remark, every dismissive tone, they became the rhythm of my determination. Each word they used to belittle me turned into a stepping stone I used to climb higher. I started to love the challenge, the quiet power of being underestimated. There's something liberating about people thinking you're not capable. It gives you the space to surprise them all. And as I moved forward, I realized something even deeper. Their laughter didn't break me, it built me. It forced me to find my inner strength, to listen to the voice inside me that whispered, "You can." That voice was small at first, but it grew louder every day I refused to give up. And while they were busy doubting me, I was busy becoming the kind of person who no longer needed their approval. The truth is, the most powerful revenge isn't anger. It's success born out of self-respect. When you've been called just anything, you learn to redefine that word. I was just a secretary, but I was also the one who learned how companies run, how people think, and how dreams evolve. Every task I did with care, every mistake I learned from, every moment I stayed quiet and observed, it all became part of my story. I wasn't waiting for someone to give me a chance, I was building my own. And slowly, without realizing it, the words that once wounded me became the reason I kept going. Belief is a quiet thing at first. It doesn't start with loud confidence or grand gestures. It begins as a whisper, a small voice that says, "Maybe I can." When everyone else doubts you, When even your reflection starts to look unsure, that tiny voice becomes your only light. For me, believing in myself wasn't easy. I grew up surrounded by expectations that told me to stay small, to know my place, to not dream too loudly. Every time I tried to speak about my goals, I was met with polite smiles or sarcastic laughter. They didn't see potential in me, they saw limits. And for a while, I saw them too. There were moments when self-belief felt like pretending. When I'd sit in my room after work, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was fooling myself. I didn't have the fancy degrees or the powerful connections others did. I had nothing but determination and a belief that someday, all my effort would make sense. But belief, I learned, isn't about being sure of the future. It's about trusting yourself even when the path ahead is dark. It's about continuing to move forward when no one claps, when no one watches, when no one cares. The power of self-belief doesn't come from external validation, it grows from small victories. Like the first time I solved a problem no one else could. The first time I stayed late and finished a project perfectly. The first time I looked at my work and felt proud, not because someone praised me, but because I knew I gave it everything. Those moments were seeds. Tiny, invisible, but alive. Every act of effort watered them, and slowly, something began to grow inside me, a sense of worth that no insult could destroy. There were people around me who thrived on comparison. They loved to remind me of what I wasn't. They'd talk about someone else's success and glance at me like I was a failure waiting to happen. It used to hurt deeply until one day I realized that their words didn't define me, my reaction did. I stopped listening to them and started listening to myself. I began writing down my goals, not for anyone to see, but to remind myself that I had direction. I wrote affirmations on small pieces of paper and kept them in my notebook. You are enough. Keep going. It's not about where you are, it's about where you're headed. They were simple words, but they became my armor. Belief is not a gift, it's a discipline. It's something you build every single day, especially when you feel weakest. I taught myself to focus on progress instead of perfection. When I failed, I didn't stop, I analyzed, learned, and tried again. I realized that people who succeed aren't necessarily the smartest or the most talented. They're simply the ones who refuse to stop believing in themselves, even when everything around them says they should. And that kind of belief isn't loud, it's patient, persistent, and unbreakable. There were days I stood in front of the mirror and forced myself to say, "You can do this," even when tears blurred my vision. It wasn't always convincing, but repetition made it real. Slowly, belief became part of who I was. It stopped being a dream and became a mindset. When my family dismissed my ambitions, I didn't argue anymore. I smiled and let my silence speak. I knew that one day, they would see what I saw in myself all along. I didn't need to prove my worth, I needed to live it. The world has a way of testing your belief. It throws challenges at you, waits to see if you'll crumble. And sometimes I did. Sometimes I broke down, questioned everything, and felt like giving up. But belief isn't about never falling, it's about getting up every single time. Each failure taught me that belief without resilience is fragile. I had to strengthen it, day by day, like a muscle. I started embracing mistakes instead of fearing them. Every error became evidence that I was trying, that I was growing, that I was human. Eventually, belief became my quiet rebellion. It was my way of saying, "You don't decide who I am." I stopped waiting for approval, stopped seeking permission to dream. I realized I was capable of creating opportunities where none existed. And once that realization took root, nothing felt impossible anymore. The same people who once doubted me began to look at me differently, not because I changed overnight, but because I finally believed in the person I had always been. Belief changes your energy, your posture, your presence. People can sense it even before you speak. It's not arrogance, it's awareness. The awareness that your value doesn't need to be validated because it was never lost to begin with. There's something powerful about believing in yourself when no one else does. It transforms fear into fuel, doubt into drive, and pain into purpose. It gives you the courage to start, even when you don't know how things will end. And in those quiet moments of struggle, when no one's watching and no one's helping, that belief becomes your best friend, your motivator, and your reason to keep going. There's a certain strength in silence. The kind that doesn't shout for attention or demand recognition. When I began working toward my goals, I realized that the loudest people were often the ones doing the least, while those who truly achieved something meaningful were busy working in quiet corners, unnoticed, uncelebrated. I decided I wanted to be one of those people. I didn't need the world to see my every step. I needed to take those steps with purpose. I learned to find peace in being unseen, knowing that one day, the results would speak for themselves. Working in silence became my secret power. I stopped telling people what I was planning and started showing them only what I had finished. Every project I worked on, every late-night effort, every small win was mine to keep until it was strong enough to face the world. The truth is, silence protects you. It shields your dreams from doubt, from envy, from careless words that can break fragile beginnings. When I kept my goals private, I felt freer. No one could mock what they didn't know about, and no one could measure my progress but me. There were nights when the quiet felt heavy, when I wished someone would understand the effort I was putting in. But I also knew that seeking validation too early can destroy motivation. So, I stayed silent, even when the work got hard. I let my routine become my statement. Every morning, I woke up with one thought: improve. No noise, no announcements, just progress. And over time, that consistency became unshakable. The silence turned into focus, and focus turned into results. When people underestimate you, they give you a gift. They stop watching, stop expecting, and that gives you space to build without pressure. I used that space to learn everything I could. While others were distracted by appearances, I was building substance. I studied, practiced, failed quietly, and learned privately. I didn't post about my failures, I studied them. I didn't tell people my next move, I prepared for it. Working in silence isn't about hiding, it's about protecting what matters until it's ready. It's about giving your dreams time to grow without the noise of outside opinions. There's a strange satisfaction in seeing the surprise on people's faces when you finally reveal what you've been working on. That moment when they realize you were never idle, you were just busy becoming something greater. Success has a unique sound when it finally speaks. It's calm, confident, undeniable. You don't have to announce it because it announces itself. I started to understand that silence was not the absence of noise, it was the presence of discipline. And that discipline carried me through every doubt, every obstacle, every sleepless night. Sometimes people would ask why I didn't talk more about my plans. They thought I was being secretive or shy, but I wasn't. I was protecting my energy. I had learned the hard way that not everyone clapping for you wants to see you win. Some only want to measure your progress so they can remind you when you fall. I decided I would let my success do the talking, and when it did, it would speak in a language that even my critics couldn't ignore. I wanted my achievements to echo louder than any explanation ever could. The silence taught me patience. It taught me that success doesn't come from rushing or shouting, it comes from steady, unseen effort. It comes from the hours no one counts, the struggles no one sees, and the determination that doesn't fade when no one is watching. Every time I felt like giving up, I reminded myself that quiet progress is still progress. Just because no one sees you growing doesn't mean you're not. The world notices only when the results are visible, but you have to keep working long before that happens. I learned to enjoy being underestimated. There's freedom in it. When people assume you're ordinary, you're free to move without expectations. You can fail without judgment, rise without interference, and build your strength in peace. I used their underestimation as fuel. I didn't need to correct them, I needed to keep going. I didn't need to defend my silence, I needed to make it meaningful. Because when the time finally came to step forward, the contrast between who they thought I was and who I had become was enough to leave them speechless. The day my efforts finally came to light, I realized that all those quiet years had been worth it. The world saw the success, but I saw the journey, the long nights, the doubts, the sacrifices, and the quiet resilience that had carried me here. Working in silence had not only built my career, it had built my character. It taught me to rely on myself, to trust the process, and to find satisfaction in progress that no one else could see. And in the end, The silence wasn't empty, it was full of purpose, effort, and transformation waiting for its moment to be heard. For most of my life, I was known by one label, the secretary. That single word carried weight, not because of what it meant, but because of how people said it. Their tone made it sound small, as if being a secretary defined the limits of my intelligence, ambition, and worth. At first, I let that label sit on my shoulders like a burden. I began to shrink myself to fit inside the expectations others had for me. But with time, I realized that identity isn't given to you, it's something you create. And no label, no title, no job description can define the depth of who you are or what you're capable of becoming. Redefining identity began the day I decided to stop introducing myself by what I did and start defining myself by who I was. I wasn't just someone who followed instructions or organized schedules. I was someone who learned, who observed, who built connections, and who dreamed bigger than the position on my nameplate. I started to see my job as a platform, not a prison. Every skill I learned, every conversation I listened to, every challenge I handled, it all became part of a silent transformation. While others saw a simple role, I saw opportunity. I turned every task into a lesson, every mistake into a teacher, every limitation into a question I was determined to answer. It's easy for the world to box you in. People are comfortable when they can label you because it helps them understand you quickly. But those labels are not always kind. They come from assumptions, not from truth. For a long time, I accepted the label because fighting it felt exhausting. But one day, I realized that accepting their version of me meant rejecting my own. And that was the moment everything changed. I decided I would no longer live as the version of myself they expected. I would build a new one quietly, patiently, authentically. There's a special kind of strength that comes from redefining yourself. It's not loud or dramatic, it's gradual. It starts when you stop seeking permission to be more. When you stop waiting for people to notice your growth. When you stop introducing yourself through your title and start speaking from your vision. I began investing time in self-development. I took online courses, read about business strategies, and surrounded myself with people who inspired growth rather than limited it. Every new thing I learned made that old label feel smaller and smaller until it no longer fit me at all. But change doesn't go unnoticed. My family, friends, and even colleagues started to sense something different. They couldn't quite explain it, but they could see it. I wasn't the same quiet girl sitting behind a desk anymore. My confidence began to change the energy in the room. When I spoke, people listened differently. Not because of my job title, but because of the clarity and purpose in my voice. I realized then that identity is not a matter of what you do, it's how you do it. You can be in any position, but if you carry yourself with vision, people start to see beyond the surface. There were times when old voices tried to pull me back. Some people couldn't handle my growth because it didn't fit their story of who I was supposed to be. They would say things like, "Don't forget where you came from," as if my past disqualified my future. But I learned that remembering where you came from doesn't mean staying there. Growth doesn't mean forgetting your roots, it means planting new ones. Every time someone tried to remind me of my old label, I used it as a reminder of how far I had come. Redefining identity isn't about proving others wrong, it's about proving yourself right. It's about looking in the mirror and seeing not what you were told to be, but what you've worked to become. I started to understand that self-definition is one of the most powerful forms of freedom. No one can limit you once you've learned to name yourself. I began to define myself through values: resilience, curiosity, compassion, determination. Those words became my new identity, and no one could take them away from me. It wasn't easy. There were days when doubt crept in, when I felt the pull of old insecurities whispering that maybe I wasn't enough. But I kept moving forward. I kept reminding myself that identity is fluid, not fixed. Every day is a new chance to choose who you want to be. And I chose to be someone who kept growing no matter how others chose to define me. The moment I truly understood this, I stopped hiding behind titles. I no longer needed to wait for validation. I realized that real confidence doesn't come from a promotion or recognition. It comes from knowing who you are when no one else seems to see it. It comes from doing your best even when no one is watching. It comes from the quiet certainty that your worth isn't attached to a role, but to the person you become while playing it. And with every step, every success, every lesson learned, the old version of me faded a little more, making space for the person I was always meant to be. They said I should be grateful for having a job, that being a secretary was a safe and respectable place to stay. At first, I accepted that. I convinced myself that stability was better than chasing impossible dreams. But the truth is, every time someone reminded me of what I was, it echoed in my mind as what I could never be. That constant reminder became a quiet ache inside me. I was surrounded by people who believed titles measured worth, and in their eyes, mine was small. But deep inside, I started to question that belief. Why should a word decide how far I can go? Why should a position define my limits when my heart knew I was capable of more? The process of redefining myself began the day I stopped waiting for someone else to tell me who I was. I realized that identity isn't what others give you, it's what you decide to claim. I looked at my title, my surroundings, and my daily routine, and I thought, this is not my ceiling, it's just my beginning. Every phone call I answered, every report I typed, every meeting I scheduled became part of my education. I was not just doing a job, I was learning how the business world worked from the inside out. While others saw paperwork, I saw patterns. While they saw tasks, I saw lessons. Slowly, I started building a new version of myself within the same space where they thought I would always stay. But change, even quiet change, never goes unnoticed. My family thought I was being unrealistic when I talked about ideas bigger than my position. They would smile and say, "That's nice, but don't forget your place." Their words were meant to protect me, but they felt like chains. It took time for me to understand that people often label others based on their own fears. They don't mean harm, they just don't see beyond what they know. So, instead of arguing, I began showing them through actions. I worked harder, learned faster, and built skills that no title could define. Each new thing I learned was a small rebellion against the label that had kept me boxed in. Every person carries multiple versions of themselves, the one the world sees, and the one waiting to be discovered. I began connecting with that second version of me, the one that believed in quiet potential. I no longer introduced myself as just a secretary. I started saying, I'm someone who helps businesses grow, because that's what I was doing. Words matter, and the way we describe ourselves shapes how others see us. Once I changed my language, everything around me started to shift. People began to take me more seriously, not because my role changed, but because I did. There were moments when I doubted my progress. It's hard to redefine yourself when everyone insists on reminding you of who you used to be. I'd hear my family gossiping about how I was dreaming too big, and those words would sting. But then I'd remind myself that identity is not about who you were yesterday. It's about who you're becoming today. I kept pushing forward, even when no one understood why. I stayed late, asked questions, read about leadership and management, studied successful people, and slowly, I started to think like them. My mindset grew bigger than my title, and eventually, my opportunities did too. Redefining yourself means separating your value from your position. It means understanding that your worth doesn't depend on where you start, but on how you grow. I stopped comparing myself to others and focused instead on who I was becoming. The same people who once dismissed me began coming to me for advice. They didn't realize that while they were underestimating me, I was evolving. Every time they used the word, just, I quietly erased it in my mind. I wasn't just anything, I was becoming someone who refused to be limited by anyone's opinion. The most powerful shift happened when I started believing that identity is not something permanent. It's fluid, alive, always changing. The world loves to put people into neat boxes, but those boxes can't hold someone who decides to grow. I began to see my work differently. Instead of a list of duties, I saw a training ground. Instead of being part of the background, I became part of the foundation. Every challenge that came my way was an opportunity to strengthen the new identity I was building. When people talked about me, I noticed how their tone changed. There was hesitation in their words, as if they were unsure how to describe me anymore. That's when I knew I was no longer defined by their labels. I didn't need a new title to validate my growth, my actions had already rewritten the story. I learned that redefining yourself isn't about erasing your past, it's about reinterpreting it. Every experience, Even the ones that made me feel small became part of the bigger picture I was creating. The same family that once said, "You're just a secretary," started asking how I managed to get my ideas published, how I built connections, how I got noticed by people beyond our small circle. And the answer was simple: I stopped letting them decide who I was. I stopped shrinking to fit their version of me and started growing into my own. I realized that the only real limit to identity is the one we accept. Once I broke that limit, the world began to open in ways I never thought possible. There's a moment in every journey when you realize that seeking validation from others only keeps you small. I used to crave approval from my family, from my colleagues, from anyone who could look at me and say, "You're doing well." Every compliment felt like oxygen, and every criticism felt like a wound. But over time, I discovered that living for other people's approval is a prison that looks like comfort. It feels safe because you're following expectations, but deep inside, it suffocates your own voice. I began to see that family validation and self-validation are two very different things, and one of them leads you away from yourself. When my family told me I should be content being a secretary, I believed them for a while. I thought they were right, that my dreams were too ambitious. They weren't cruel, they were cautious. They wanted stability for me, something they could understand. But I wasn't born to live inside their comfort zone. I was born to explore mine. Every time they said, "You're doing fine, don't aim too high," I felt a quiet rebellion grow inside me. I wanted to be proud of myself, not because they finally approved, but because I had learned to approve of myself. It took me years to understand that validation is an inside job. No one can give you peace about who you are except you. I started noticing how deeply I depended on others' opinions. If they praised me, I felt strong. If they doubted me, I crumbled. That was no way to live. I decided I would no longer let their voices decide the value of my choices. I began to listen to my own. Self-validation is not arrogance, it's acceptance. It's standing in front of the mirror and saying, "I'm proud of how far I've come," even when no one else sees your effort. At first, it felt lonely. When you stop chasing approval, you lose a kind of comfort. My family didn't understand why I stopped asking for their opinion before making decisions. They thought I was being distant, maybe even ungrateful. But what I was really doing was growing. I started measuring my success by my own standards, how much I learned, how much courage I showed, how much better I was than the person I used to be. The more I practiced this, the lighter I felt. The noise of other people's expectations started to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence that didn't need permission to exist. There's a deep difference between being loved for who people think you are and being loved for who you truly are. I learned that many people, even family, love the version of you that fits their comfort. When you start to grow beyond that, it unsettles them. They don't mean harm, they just don't understand your growth yet. I used to think I had to choose between making them proud and making myself happy. But the truth is, when you learn to validate yourself, their pride stops being your goal, it becomes a bonus. You stop chasing their applause and start focusing on your purpose. I remember the first time I accomplished something big and didn't rush to tell anyone. I just sat quietly, feeling proud. That moment felt powerful. It wasn't about showing the world, it was about recognizing my own worth. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. I didn't need their praise to know I was on the right path. And surprisingly, when I stopped trying to earn validation, I started to get it naturally. People began to notice the confidence in my actions, the calm in my voice, the independence in my decisions. Validation stopped being something I begged for, it became something I attracted. There were still moments of doubt, times when I wanted to hear someone say, "We're proud of you." But instead of waiting, I started saying it to myself. I wrote it in my journal, whispered it before going to sleep, and repeated it after every small win. It felt strange at first, but eventually, it became real. I learned that self-validation is not about ignoring others, it's about not depending on them for your peace. It's choosing to believe that your worth is not negotiable, no matter how long it takes for others to recognize it. When my family finally saw my picture on the Fortune magazine cover, their silence said more than words ever could. For years, I had chased that silence, waiting for it to turn into recognition. But when it finally came, I realized I no longer needed it. Because long before that cover, I had already found my validation within myself. That realization changed everything. It taught me that success feels different when it's rooted in self-acceptance rather than external approval. The truth is, we spend so much of our lives trying to make others proud that we forget to make ourselves proud first. Family validation can be comforting, but it's temporary. Self-validation, once built, becomes unshakable. It stays with you when the world doubts you, when people misunderstand you, when life tests you. It gives you the strength to keep moving even when applause turns into silence. And once you've learned to give that to yourself, no one can take it away.